Oh, thank you very much for the opportunity of being here with you, learning from this very successful CDT program. Uh, and I will be discussing with you sustainable supply chains, smart technologies, and the COVID-19 pandemic. So some research opportunities and challenges. But of course, from a management perspective, because I'm based in a business school, Lincoln International Business School. So the discussion is based on two central objectives. So the first one is to address key issues in green and sustainable supply chains. I believe that most of the technologies that the CDT is going to develop will be deployed and transform supply chains. And the potential research agenda on sustainable supply chains 4.0 after COVID. So as our audience is diverse, I'll just show you the basic concept of supply chain. So a supply chain usually has a focal company, a company which is, the most important company, has the bargaining power in a supply chain. And the supply chain coordinates the movement of goods and data from suppliers to final customers. A supply chain can be either domestic or global modern supply chains. Basically, most of supply chains that we have nowadays are modern and global international supply chains. But 2 decades ago, the need for greener supply chains emerged based on classic papers like this, when the greening of operations management was defended. And as you can see here, greening the supply chain is one of the pillars of any green and sustainable operations strategy. And then this area called the green supply chain started evolving. You can see here classic papers defining and conceptualizing the meaning of green supply chains. And more recently, colleagues and I have proposed a multi-dimensional framework to understand green supply chain practices. So in this framework, for example, colleagues and I have addressed how organizational theories are useful to understand green supply chain practices such as eco-design, environmental innovations, or green purchasing, or cooperation with customers in a supply chain. So these are green supply chain practices that I believe will be transformed and affected by the technologies that programs like the CDT are developing. But there is another evolution from green to sustainable supply chains. So nowadays, we discuss sustainable supply chains based on this kind of literature, if you are interested in this. And a sustainable supply chain is, of course, the management of material, information, capital flows, cooperation with companies along a supply chain, but taking into account economic, social, and environmental aspects, and also how a supply chain considers the perspectives from customers and stakeholders. So if your supply chain doesn't engage with stakeholders, you can't say you are running a sustainable supply chain. And this is a classic framework in which we can understand the triggers of a supply chain, which is sustainable. So a supply chain to be sustainable must have the focal company investing a lot in sustainability. So if the focal company is not willing to invest in new sustainable technologies practices, any initiative of sustainability in the supply chain will be likely to fail. And you have triggers of a sustainable supply chain. We are talking about government initiatives, customers' pressure, and stakeholders' pressures. So this is a classic framework to understand how sustainable supply chains practices are adopted in complex and modern supply chains. But the question is that COVID-19 is disrupting both green and sustainable supply chains, and much more research about it is necessary. For example, how technologies will reduce, mitigate this disruption. So this is a very interesting graphic, World Uncertainty Index. And as you can see here, we have the privilege of, living the peak of uncertainty in the world. And this uncertainty caused by COVID is really disrupting global supply chains, international supply chains. Why? Because global supply chains rely on international trade and logistics, lean inventories, multi-tiered supply chains. So you have suppliers of suppliers of suppliers, which is very difficult to coordinate. These supply chains are designed to keep inventory and the labor cost at minimum, access to key suppliers and markets. These global supply chains might suffer from cost cut obsession, and they might suffer from systemic weaknesses. So what happens with global supply chains is that they have reduced internal risks related to inventory and reduced the number of suppliers. But as supply chains go global, they increase very much external risks of disruption. And as you can see here, COVID-19 has created three kinds of risks and disruptions. For example, sustainable supply chains during the pandemic found themselves in a difficult situation concerning business goals. So lack of productivity, profitability, revenue, shareholder obligations, and the customers' complaints went up. Social and environmental disruptions. So the safety and well-being of the workforce was affected. Generation of jobs, payment of tax, fair treatment of suppliers, capacity to run waste management, recycling initiatives. And customer satisfaction was also affected. For example, availability of products and services, quality of products, health and safety, fair prices. So as you can see here, COVID-19 is disrupting many of these dimensions of sustainable supply chains. And there has been evidence that smart technologies will enhance the sustainability of supply chains by mitigating those potential disruptions. So, for example, if you look at the Financial Times, it has been reported that COVID-19 is really accelerating the adoption of Industry 4.0 technologies. Wall Street Journal has just said that COVID-19 is triggering major adoption of Industry 4.0 technologies in supply chains. Most technologies relate to remote working, contactless technologies in supply chains, and automation. So robots, and so these are trends that are here to stay, probably. This report says that supply chains in the future will be supply chains 4.0, intense on Internet of Things, advanced robotics, blockchain, big data, predictive analytics. And these technologies will unlock faster, more accurate, more flexible, efficient, automated, and we hope as well, greener supply chains, reducing waste. But there are many questions to be investigated further. For example, will smart technologies unlock truly sustainable supply chains? And this is because those frameworks about the meaning of sustainable supply chains are relevant. Otherwise, we can't understand the impact of smart technologies on supply chains. What are the critical factors of the integration of green and sustainable chains and the Industry 4.0 technologies? What companies should do? What managers must know about integrating and adopting smart technologies? We are talking about motivators, drivers, and organizational barriers. Will emerging technologies such as blockchain enhance transparency of sustainable supply chains? We can talk about modern slavery in supply chains and how blockchain will be important to deal with this. How Industry 4.0 technologies can enhance multi-tier supply chains when you have suppliers of suppliers of suppliers in different locations in the world. The challenges of sustainable supply chains 4.0 in emerging markets, when you have institutional characteristics that should be observed. How to manage cutting-edge innovation across members of a supply chain. For example, the CDT develops a new technology, how to ensure that this technology will be adopted by members in a supply chain. But the great question is also how to ensure that new smart technologies in sustainable chains are socially responsible. So this is a big question. And if you have a look at this recent report that after COVID, the consumers and companies will be more interested in sustainability, corporate social responsibility, local producers, local, for example, buying local. So the question is how to ensure that digital technologies, smart new technologies are responsible. And I bring to the debate this recent framework published in MIT Sloan Management Review. With a framework, it's still a theoretical framework. It's still to be applied. But it's very interesting because the question here is how to ensure that Industry 4.0 new technologies are socially responsible. For example, you can ensure that there is data privacy, Data is protected for all employees, customers, and other stakeholders. What about diversity and inclusion? Will the new technology ensure these dimensions? Regarding the economic dimension, will the new technology replace jobs done by humans? Will this be responsible? How to mitigate the effects? In terms of environmental impact, how to ensure that the development of the technology itself is environmentally responsible and that the technology will reduce waste and environmental impact in the long run. And from the technological side, how to ensure that artificial intelligence is applied in an ethical way. For example, what about cybersecurity? So this is a very interesting debate that, of course, sustainable supply chains will be much more intense in terms of adoption of Industry 4.0 technologies. As consumers and companies will pay more attention to sustainability, how to ensure that new technologies are responsible. So I hope this will add to the debate. There are useful references here. And I thank you very much for the opportunity of being here, the CDT team, Professor Simon and Professor Ida. Thank you very much.